4, 3. Hello, here I am again in the name of the sovereign creator of heaven and earth. I'm continuing with my exposition of my translation of the Gospel of John. We have come to chapter 5 and verse 31. The Lord Jesus is in the middle of a discourse with the Pharisees where he's talking about himself. I will now read verses 31 through 36. He's going to now talk about 4 witnesses that he has. 31 through 36. No, that doesn't. No. If I testify about myself, my testimony is not valid. There is another who testifies about me, and I know that the testimony that he gives about me is true. You have sent to John, and he has testified to the truth. Yet I do not accept the testimony from a man. But I say these things so that you may be saved. That man was a burning, shining lamp, and for a time you were willing to be glad in his light. But I have a greater testimony than John's, because the works that the Father gave me to complete, the very works that I am doing, they testify about me that the Father has sent me. For the moment, according to the law, at least 2 witnesses were required. So if Jesus had only his own word, it would not be enough. That is to say, it would not be valid. Even though he was telling the truth, that was not enough. He had to have at least 2. That's the point. Not that what he said wasn't true, but it wasn't valid if it was only himself. He says here at the end of verse 32, I know that the testimony that he gives about me is true. I take it that witness has to be the Father, since in verse 34, Jesus is going to discount John the Baptizer. Not that he was angry with John, but the Jews had already rejected John, and so he is going to have other witnesses that they cannot reject, or should not at least. Going on. Verse 34, I do not accept testimony from a man. He had 3 supernatural witnesses. I say these things so that you may be saved. They had already rejected John's testimony, but he had the Father, his own works, and the Scriptures, so that was more than enough. He would like for them to turn around and be saved. So he organizes his argument in that attempt. However, they rejected it. When he says that the very works that I am doing, they testify about me that the Father has sent me, this Nicodemus, you remember, recognized that very clearly back in chapter 3. Nicodemus says, hey, anyone who does what you're doing, you have to be from God. Going on now, we will read verses 34, or I will read verses 37 through 40. Further, the Father who sent me has himself testified about me. Sorry, you have neither heard his voice nor seen his form at any time, nor do you have his word abiding in you, because you do not believe on the very one whom he sent. You examine the Scriptures because in them you think you have eternal life, yet they are the very ones that testify about me. But you are not willing to come to me so that you may have life. For the moment. Now what we have here is a declaration. The Lord declares their spiritual bankruptcy. I don't know what's wrong with my voice tonight. The Lord declares their spiritual bankruptcy. For a religious leader To have never heard God's voice is pretty poor to begin. But much worse is to study God's word without its ever finding a place in your heart, and that was their problem. They studied the word more or less, but it never found a place in their heart. He says, you don't believe in the very one that the Father sent. You examine the scriptures, you think that you have eternal life. They are the very ones. It's the scriptures that testify about me. But you are not willing to come to me so that you may have life. Like Jesus had proved over and over again that he was the Messiah, but he threatened everything that they stood for, and so they were not about to accept it. The proof was there, more than adequate, but they just didn't want to accept it. The Lord goes on now to say that they are accused by Moses. Verses 41 through 47 that will finish chapter 5. I do not accept glory from people. Rather, I have come to know you, that you do not have the love of God in you. I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. Should another come in his own name, him you will receive. How can you believe, who receive glory from men and do not seek the glory that comes from the only God? Do not suppose that I will accuse you before the Father. Moses is the one who accuses you, on whom you have set your hope. Because if you really believed Moses, you would believe me, because he wrote about me. But since you do not believe in his writings, how will you believe in my sayings? For the moment. As he says in verse 41, he's not accepting glory from people. In fact, he doesn't even need the witness of John the Baptizer because he had 3 supernatural witnesses. But he says in verse 42, I have come to know you. That's what the text says. I have come to know. Presumably, he is referring to knowledge gained by observation. They had clearly demonstrated in his presence that, in fact, they did not have God's love. Now, what does the Lord mean in the second half of 43 when he says, should another come in his own name, him you will receive? I don't know. Might this be a prophetic reference to the Antichrist? I don't know, perhaps. Verse 44, I think, is just a little bit serious. Let's read this one. Read again. How can you believe who receive glory from men and do not seek the glory that comes from the only God? I take it that this is serious. Apparently, one's attitude toward glory affects that person's ability to believe. In other words, if the approval of people is more important to you than the approval of God, you probably are not going to believe into Jesus, because most people are against it, and more so in today's culture. It'd be very hard. If you want the glory of men, you probably are not going to believe into Jesus. You have to really want the glory that comes from God. Now Jesus, he says in verse 45, he's not going to have to accuse them before the Father. Moses is going to accuse them. And they, of course, claimed that they were following Moses, and Moses was their big hero or whatever. Verse 46, he says, if you really believed Moses, but they weren't really, you would believe me. Why? Because he wrote about me. So now he says in verse 47, but since you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my sayings? I take it here that the Lord is affirming the inspiration and authority of Moses' writings, because in effect he places them on a level with his own word, for which he claims eternal authority. You'll find that in Luke chapter 21 and verse 33. The Lord claims very plainly eternal authority for his own word. So he is putting Moses on a level with his own word. That is Moses' writings. Now we come to chapter 6. And here Jesus is back in Galilee. I take it that almost a whole year has elapsed between chapters 5 and 6 here. For the events that transpired during that period, you can see Luke chapter 6, verse 1 through chapter 9, verse 10, and Mark chapter 2, verse 23 through chapter 6, verse 31, and the corresponding accounts in Matthew. Matthew jumps around a bit. Now I will read verses 1 through 4 in chapter 6. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, or Tiberias, and a huge crowd was following him because they had seen his signs that he kept performing on the sick. So Jesus went up on the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, within parenthesis, now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was near, close parenthesis. From the parallel accounts, it appears that Jesus embarked at Capernaum. Matthew informs us that he had just heard of the baptizer's ignominious death and wanted to get away, probably, or maybe to grieve and assimilate the news. But from John chapter 6, verse 23, further on this chapter, we learn that the destination was near Tiberias. Well, now, Capernaum and Tiberias are both on the western side of the Sea of Galilee, but there's a large bay between them. So they went over 6 to 8 miles of water. Let's see if you can see this beautiful thing here. If I can get to one side so I can see myself what I'm doing. Okay, up here is Capernaum, and down, whoops, I'm backward here. Down here is Tiberias. If I can, I have to work my hand backwards. Well, you see there's this huge bay here, a big bay. That's probably a good 10 miles across there. So that's what they had to cross. A huge crowd was following. You have to read Mark to get the whole picture here. And in a minute, I'm going to read an article, a short article that I have in my appendix, Bethsaida or Tiberias. That's number 8 in the 3rd edition of my New Testament in English. I'm going to read now the footnote that I have here at the end of verse 2. The crowd was not about to let Jesus get away. And Mark makes very clear that they ran along the shore. They ran, I just can't get it. They ran, oops, I got to go the other way. They ran along the shore. I'm not good at doing a mirror image. You can see that they just went along. Not so good. Sorry about that. Anyway, they ran along the shore. The faster runners would stay even with the boat, especially if they didn't have a wind and were having to row. That was a big fishing boat. Now, some of them, the faster runners, would be waiting on the shore when the boat put in. The others would be spread out behind for several miles, like in a marathon. They would keep arriving. Any late starters would see the stragglers and could easily follow the action. Apparently, the Lord Jesus immediately started to heal the sick and went on to teach. You'll get that in Matthew 14:14 and Mark 6:34. But just where was it? John says it was near Tiberias. But Luke chapter 9 and verse 10 says it was a deserted place belonging to a town called Bethsaida. Lamentably, less than 1% of the Greek manuscripts of objectively inferior quality, they have into a town called Bethsaida. You'll find that in many modern versions, NIV, NASB, Living Bible, so on and so on. But that makes Luke contradict himself, because in verse 12 of Luke, he says it was a deserted place. Well, it can't be in the middle of the town and in a deserted place at the same time. And it also, of course, contradicts the parallel accounts. I assume that the place was indeed Tiberias, but did indeed belong to Bethsaida. Either it had been deeded to the town somehow, or the family that owned it was based in Bethsaida. Any neighbors, near neighbors, could not use it, so it was basically untouched, a great place for a picnic. I'm going to just take the liberty here. I'm going to repeat some of what I just said, but since people have claimed that we have a discrepancy in the text, and that's one of the things that I like to resolve, I'm going to read this. We have Luke against John. The question is exactly, where was it? Where was the feeding of the 5,000? Was it in Bethsaida, up yonder, or was it near Tiberias, down here on the other side? Because Bethsaida was on the eastern side of the Jordan River, or whatever it was coming in at the top. Capernaum's on the western side, but Tiberias, as I already showed you, is also on the western side. The question is, therefore, where did it happen? Where did the feeding of the 5,000 happen? Matthew 14:13 and Mark 6:32 merely say that it was in a deserted spot without any identification of the place. Luke 9:10, it says it was a deserted place belonging to a town named Bethsaida. I already told you what some bad manuscripts do to that. But John 6:23 informs us that the spot was near the town of Tiberias, and we are in John. We'll get there in a minute. Well, of course, Tiberias was located on the west side of the sea, a mile or two above the place where the Jordan River leaves the sea. But Bethsaida was at the top of the sea, a little onto the east of where the Jordan, or whatever that little river is, enters the sea. So what do? We may deduce from Mark 6:31 and John 6:17 and verse 24 that Jesus and his disciples started out from Capernaum, where, as a matter of fact, Jesus had his base of operations. It happens that both Capernaum and Bethsaida are situated, or were situated, but still are situated at the top of the sea. But Capernaum is a little bit to the west of the entrance of the Jordan. But John 6:1 says that Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee. Well, that agrees better with Tiberias, since there's a large bay between Capernaum and Tiberias, as I showed you rather poorly. Although they were both on the west side of the sea. So they crossed close to 10 miles of water. Further, after the feast, the feeding, Matthew 14:22 says that they went by boat to the other side. And verse 24, still of Matthew, has them in the middle of the sea. While Mark chapter 6:45 says that they went by boat to the other side, to Bethsaida. To Bethsaida. Mark says that. And verse 47 in Mark has them in the middle of the sea as well. John 6 verse 17 says that they started to cross the sea toward Capernaum. And verse 19 that they had rowed some 3 or 4 miles. Well, now, to stay close to the shore is one thing. To go over the sea is another. I'm not very good at a mirror image here, but you can follow the sea. To go from Capernaum to Bethsaida, you're just following the shore. You're not crossing the sea. Now here you can say you crossed the sea, but of course going from here to there, you are most emphatically crossing the sea, and you are going to the other side. This would be a good 8 miles across here. So in the middle, right here, be about 4 miles from either shore. 4 miles from here and 4 miles from there. We'll get to that in a minute. Okay, to stay close to the shore is one thing, to go over the sea is another. Further, if they were already in or near Bethsaida, as some translations say Luke has it, how could they cross the sea in order to get there? If they're already there, they don't cross the sea to get there if they're already there. And if you're following the coast, you're not crossing the sea either. it becomes clear that the miracle, in fact, took place near Tiberias, as, in fact, John affirms. But that raises another difficulty. How could a property near Tiberias belong to Bethsaida? Luke chapter 9, verse 10. Either it had been deeded to the town somehow, or more likely, I think, it belonged to a family that lived in Bethsaida. My reason for saying that is based on the text here. John 6:17 says that they started toward Capernaum, while Mark 6:45 says that they went to Bethsaida. Well, at the beginning, of course, it's about the same thing. You're starting from here. Whether you're going to Capernaum or going to Bethsaida, you're going in the same general direction at the beginning. Later on, of course, it becomes clear what you're doing. Okay. Since the two towns of Capernaum and Bethsaida were a very short distance apart, at the beginning of the crossing, the direction would be virtually the same, as I just showed you. I understand that they did indeed go to Bethsaida, Mark says that, but spent very little time there, going from there directly to Gennesaret, and Gennesaret is just below Capernaum. Capernaum is up here, and Gennesaret is right there, just below it. So, actually, the day after the miracle, Jesus was already back in Capernaum, as we will see in a minute in John chapter 6 and verses 24 and 25. So just why did they make that side trip to Bethsaida? Because Gennesaret lies just south of Capernaum, as I just showed you. My answer is the following. A property near Tiberias, but belonging to someone in Bethsaida, would likely be deserted, a great place for a picnic. I suppose that Jesus had permission to use that place when he wanted to get away. But no one had foreseen a crowd of perhaps 15,000 people. Where did I get that? Well, you have 5,000 men. The text says that. 5,000 men besides women and children. Well, in about what crowd, what do you have more of? As well as, of course, mothers with sick children and whatnot. Probably, well, there's certainly a whole lot more than 5. Whether it was 15,000, I don't know. But just stop and think about it. Pardon the unpleasant consideration, but just what effect would a crowd that size have on the hygiene of the place and the appearance of the place? 5,000 people, 10,000 people, they just make a mess, you know that. Especially if they're there for a number of hours, as was the case. I conclude that Jesus felt obliged to give a report to the owner in Bethsaida. That was why they just there. They just stopped to give a report, and immediately he went across to Gennesaret and from there up to Capernaum. Okay, that was my wee little article. I have something else to say, but that comes from John, and so we can go back now to John. Jesus went up on the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Comparing the other accounts, I take it that they had already spent quite a bit of time on the beach. The afternoon was wearing away. Since verse 6 says that he knew what he was going to do, I suppose it was a deliberate move to get the crowd up where there was grass, so they could sit down on grass instead of on whether sand or maybe pebbles. Probably not a very nice beach. Now we come to verse 4, and I have to confess I don't understand why verse 4 is here. It doesn't have anything to do with the story. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was near. However, it does give us a time frame. Since chapter 5 happened at Passover time, there was an interval of a year. Now I'm going to read verses 5 through 9. You really need to read the parallel passages as well. Then raising his eyes and observing that a huge crowd was coming toward him, Jesus says to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread so that these folks may eat?" Now he said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was about to do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for them, so that each of them could receive a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, says to him, that's to Jesus, "There is a little boy here who has 5 loaves of barley bread and 2 small fish, but what are they for so many?" Just for the moment. According to the other accounts, the 3 accounts, it's one of the few things that all 4 Gospels talk about or record. The disciples had already suggested to Jesus that he send the people away to the surrounding towns to buy food. But let's just stop and think a minute. How many bread stores would a village have? If there were any villages nearby, there was Tiberias. And how much bread would a store still have on hand at 5 p.m.? You have your bread for breakfast. If all those people could have gone to a store, every store within a radius of 30 miles, I doubt if they could have found even 10,000 loaves of bread. So I take it that the Lord's suggestion of questioning really shows that what the disciples wanted was a cop-out. They just wanted to get rid of the crowd. They didn't care what happened to the crowd. Now, when Philip talks about 200 denarii worth of bread, that's 200 days of wages of for manual labor. The other denarii was the wage for 1 day of manual labor. 200 days of manual labor. Well, that's quite a bit. How much bread could you buy with that much? Well, probably an awful lot if you could find the bread to buy. But where are you going to find that much bread to buy? But the crowd was so large that Philip figured that even that probably wouldn't do it. Now we have this boy. I think we have to understand that the boy handed his bread and fish over willingly. He would not have been forced to do it. Jesus wouldn't have done that. So if he did it willingly, the boy participated in the miracle. And I say that's a great example for us to follow. We also must give to God willingly. And when we do, we participate in the results. Okay? Does that make sense? But of course, 5 loaves and 2 fish, come on. Now I will read verses 10 through 13. Verse 14 is something else which only John brings. We'll read now 10 through 13. Then Jesus said, "Make the people recline." Now there was plenty of grass in the place, so the men reclined, about 5,000 in number. Then Jesus took the loaves, and having given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those who were reclining. So too with the fish, as much as they wanted. So when they were full, he says to his disciples, "Collect the leftover fragments so that nothing be wasted." So they collected and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves that were left over from those who had eaten. Sounds like only the men reclined, not the women. Of course, the children, you can't probably control them too well. Unfortunately, perhaps 3% of the Greek manuscripts of inferior quality omit the reference to the disciples doing the distributing. And that leaves Jesus distributing directly to the crowd. as in most modern versions, unfortunately, which of course makes John contradict the other three Gospels, because the other three Gospels all say that Jesus gave it to the disciples to the crowd. That's a very interesting story in itself, but I don't want to take time with that right now. I think maybe I've talked about that in other Gospels. Notice that the Lord does not want any waste. No waste. You would think, oh, a guy who can multiply 5 fish into all that, so what? He can multiply anytime. No, not exactly. Notice the Lord is very careful. Nothing is to be wasted. Nothing is to be wasted. You're supposed to collect it all. They filled 12 baskets. Where did they get the baskets? They were probably large baskets. They were probably borrowed from the fishing boats that came from Tiberias, which was just right down the shore a little ways. You see that in verse 23 below. Of course, the disciples doubtless had help with the collecting. And in any case, they did not keep the food. So where did the food go? Probably the food went with the baskets to whoever had loaned the baskets. So whoever loaned the baskets got a nice return for their gesture. I don't know if you've ever really thought about this too much. In another gospel, Jesus says, you give them to eat. There was no reasonable way you could do that unless you worked a miracle. The only solution was a miracle. That was really the only solution. Even if you went to the village, there was not going to be enough bread there. No. So Jesus is telling the disciples that they have to do the miracle that he was going to do in a minute. Only, of course, they weren't up to that, as we aren't either, I guess. You give them to you. But I want you to feel or sense or see the faith of the disciples. Okay, there are 12 disciples there. Jesus breaks the bread and the fish and hands a little bit to each disciple. It did not all multiply there, because if it had multiplied all at once, it would have been a huge pile. It would have buried Jesus, buried the disciples and a few other people. No. Each disciple gets a little bit of bread and fish, and they have to feed. There's this all, okay. Imagine that you're one of those disciples and you have a little bit of bread and fish, and you have to handle 1,000 people. 12 disciples, maybe 12,000 people. Wouldn't you feel just a little bit foolish? What are you going to do? The disciples, they just advance and offer the first, hey, help yourself. And the first guy takes up, and at the same time, it didn't really. He passed on. It never quit. It just kept. I take it that the very people themselves passed it, because how could the 12 disciples get around literally themselves through even 5,000 men? I'm sure that the people started then passing as that went. It just kept multiplying, just kept going. Finally, and at the end, there was some left over. And the other Gospels say that everyone was filled. They were satisfied. They weren't just a little bit to tide them over. They ate all they wanted. That was a sizable miracle, okay? Now verse 14 and 15. Now then, having seen the miraculous sign that Jesus performed, the men said, this one really is the prophet who has come into the world. So Jesus, perceiving that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, withdrew up the mountain again by himself alone. You have these guys there, and these are obviously decision makers. They're going to spend the night there on the beach, as we will see. They really wanted to make Jesus king, and Jesus was not about to let them do it. So he withdraws up the mountain to pray. But we will notice at verse 22 They're still on the beach. Just the kingmakers, if I call them that. I take it. We'll see as we go that the Jesus dealing with these kingmakers goes up to about verse 40. We'll get there in a minute. The prophet who is to come, that's a reference to Deuteronomy, as we saw when the Jews asked John who he was. Are you the prophet? I refer to Deuteronomy back yonder, talks about that. Okay, I now want to read verses 16 through 21. Now as evening came on, his disciples had gone down to the sea, and getting into the boat, they started to go across the sea toward Capernaum. Well, it had been dark for a while, and Jesus had not come to them. Further, the sea was being agitated by a strong wind blowing. Then after they had rowed some 3 or 4 miles, they see Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were afraid. But he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." Then they wanted to receive him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. For now, as I've already mentioned, starting out, whether to Capernaum or to Nazareth or Bethsaida, the direction would be basically the same. Only as you got near that, actually they went to the site as I've explained. I really find at the end of verse 17 here to be curious. Remember, John, the apostle who wrote this gospel, he was in that boat. Okay. And he says, Jesus had not come to them. Oh, wait a minute. How was Jesus going to come to them? They're out in the middle of the sea. How did they think Jesus was going to do? Because when he comes walking, they're afraid. Apparently they didn't expect that, but what did they expect? I don't quite understand that. Whatever, I guess they didn't expect it to be walking. Whatever they thought Jesus was going to maybe just appear miraculously. I don't know. I just don't know. The sea, verse 18, was agitated by a strong wind. The other gospels say the wind was contrary. So they had not had the wind. They were rowing all this time. Other gospels say it was the 4th watch of the night. No, 3 o'clock in the morning. They had been rowing for 8 or 9 hours. And that was a big boat. That was not just a little rowboat. That was a fishing boat. Like they were tired. They had rowed some 3 or 4 miles, I say. Well, actually, the text says 25 or 30 stadia. But Matthew 14:24 says in the middle of the sea. And if you draw a line here, you draw a line from Tiberias to Bethsaida. The middle of the sea is right here, 4 miles. It's about 8 miles across there, 4 miles. You're right in the middle. Now, it says here, at the end of verse 21, immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. So Jesus supernaturally transported the boat immediately 4 miles. A big fishing boat. He just transported it 4 miles, and here we are. They just were at the shore here where they were going at Bethsaida. I say that's a miracle of some size, but you will not find that miracle in most lists of what the miracles, because you really have to pay attention to the text to figure it out, and most people don't pay that much attention to the text, in my observation at least. As we compare the parallel accounts, Matthew tells us that Peter went for a little walk. Well, good old Peter. Peter could swim, all right, because after the resurrection, remember the breakfast on the beach? The boat was about 100 yards from the shore, and Peter jumps into the water and swims to the shore. So Peter could swim, but swimming in calm water is one thing, swimming in a storm is another. And he got scared and started to sink. You can find that in Matthew. But it says here, 21, they wanted to receive him into the boat. You better believe that. They were ready for a little help, please. Thank you very much. They'd been rowing, like I say, for 8 or 9 hours. And then immediately the boat is where they're going. That's a major miracle, says I. Now look, there have been repeated references to crossing the sea, being in the middle, so on. Well, the reading of the so-called critical text, really an eclectic text in Luke chapter 9, verse 10, that places the feeding of the 5,000 in the town of Bethsaida is patently ridiculous. It is stupidly ridiculous. So I ask, what could motivate the editors of those translations to print such a ridiculous reading in their text, both the Greek text and the translation? How can they do something so ridiculous? Alas, alas, alas. Now let's go to the kingmakers. Here they come on again. I'll read verses 22 through 25. If I can get my paper, it doesn't want to cooperate with my fingers here. Verses 22 through 25. The next day, the crowd that had stayed on the other side of the sea, having seen that there was no other boat there except the one into which his disciples had entered, and that Jesus had not gotten into the boat with his disciples, but only his disciples had gone away, although other boats had come from Tiberias, near the place where they ate the bread after the Lord had given thanks. So when the crowd saw that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into the boats and went to Capernaum, looking for Jesus. When they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, on another side of the sea, they said to him, Rabbi, when did you get here? This was the next morning, all right. How did you do it? No, not how. When? We'll get there. But we're now back to where the feeding of the 5,000 took place. Those men, the kingmakers I call them, they had stayed on the scene all night. They had slept there on the beach, or maybe up on the grass, of course. They were waiting for Jesus to come down from the mountain. Only he never did. Or at least he did, or if he did, they didn't see him. He may have passed invisible, or whatever. How that was, we don't know. Or he may have simply gone supernaturally until near the boat and then dropped down on the water to walk near the boat. We don't know that information. Well, they probably still wanted to make Jesus king. Otherwise, why would they have stayed there and slept there all night? That wasn't very comfortable, really. Now, they had observed very carefully that Jesus did not get into that boat, only the disciples. Now, verse 23 says that there were other boats that came from Tiberias, near the place where they ate the bread after the Lord had given thanks. He should make sure that after the Lord had given thanks. The point seems to be that only one boat came with Jesus. That's quite clear. Only one boat came with Jesus. So when it left, there was no other boat at Jesus' disposal. But the boats, doubtless, were little fishing boats from Tiberias. The day before, all that huge crowd, they had curious, they'd come to see what in the world was going on. Maybe they even loaned their baskets and whatnot. But they would not spend the night out there. They returned home for the night. Then they came back the next morning to see what was going on. So they were there then for these guys to hitch a ride back to Capernaum. Verse 24, the crowd saw that neither Jesus nor they got into those boats. Now, there probably weren't all that many boats. Well, how many people could those boats? Could there be little fishing boats? Probably less than 100 people all told. you know, all the boats together. Because a little fishing boat couldn't what, probably not more than 15, 20 people, then it starts to sink. That's too much. I take it these were, like I say, these were decision makers. These were big cheeses. They wanted to make him king. Just not any old buddy could do that. Okay. They went to Capernaum looking for Jesus. As I've already said, I gather from Matthew and Mark that from Bethsaida, Jesus went directly to Gennesaret. But verse 59 below makes clear that they found him in Capernaum, which is close by Gennesaret. And I've already explained why Jesus sent the disciples to Bethsaida. Now, I insist here in verse 25, they found him on an other side of the sea. There's no definite article with other side. It was not really the other side. It was an other side because it was just across that huge bay. It wasn't actually altogether across on the other side of the sea. Notice that they asked Jesus when. They didn't ask how. Why not? Well, they knew very well that Jesus could have walked, taken a back trail and gotten there on land, no problem. Certainly they hadn't seen him come down to any boat. But they asked when, because he got there before they did. Notice now, well, let's read. I have to get on and read now verses 26 through, well, that's a good place to stop. Let's just stop here, and we'll pick it up next video, God willing. We'll pick up at verse 26 next video. Thanks for watching.